all of you. So today we have been blessed by a very special guest. So let me introduce him in as few words as possible. These are possibly the fewest possible words to delineate his great and very important career. Poet, critic, translator, competent Rabindra Sangeet proponent, Gautam Ghoshal is a professor of English in Vibhishwa Bharati Santiniketan, from where he has retired very recently in January of this year. He is a leading interpreter of Sri Aurobindo's literature, psychology, philosophy, and sociological thoughts. He was the chief editor of Vishwa Bharati Quarterly from 2005 to 2007. Professor Ghoshal has published more than 200 papers and articles in various Indian and foreign journals, especially on Sri Aurobindo and other Indian English poets. His other areas of interest are Shakespeare, Rabindranath Tagore, Stephen Crane, and 19th century British and American literature. His major books are The Rainbow Bridge, a comparative study of Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo and World Literature, Sri Aurobindo's Prose Style, Notes on the Mother's Prayers and Meditations, Notes on the Renaissance with commentaries by Sri Aurobindo, Thoughts on American Literature, Indian Literature Points of View, Indian Responses to Shakespeare, which he has edited, and so forth. He also has published more than 200 articles in English and foreign journals, as I also mentioned earlier. Dr. Ghoshal received Doctor of Literature for his study, Lord of Language, Tradition and Experiment in Sri Aurobindo's prose styles. He has recently participated in conferences in USA, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. He is a great interpreter of Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita. Recently, he has been delivering speeches on Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel and Sri Aurobindo's major works at different centers. Recently, he has also been conducting classes on value education at Sri Aurobindo Nilay, Shantiniketan. For his unique contribution to Sri Aurobindo studies, he has received Sri Aurobindo Puraskar and Nalini Kanta Gupta Puraskar. We welcome you, sir, in today's session, and we are very blessed and very privileged to have you with us. I offer you all our hearty wishes, and we welcome you to start today's session. Thank you so very much. Thank you on the behalf of all of our students for gracing this occasion.
Thank you very much. Uh, so many things have been spoken of me, and it's actually the important thing is today's lecture on Eliot, which is my present occupation, and my whole focus is here. So, shall I start my lecture? Shall I start
Yes,
my
sir.
talk?
Yes, sir. Of course, you're free to start. Thank you so much, sir.
So, T.S. Eliot wrote this piece in 1919, and it could be as a reaction to the romantic strains still lingering in modern poetry, and it could be that he was indirectly hitting out at Yeats's early poetry, but it was a new theory, and it's called the classical theory of poetry, and it goes against Wordsworth's because he's the representative spokesperson of the Romantic Age. It goes against the theory of Romantic poetry as powerful, powerful, spontaneous play, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and emotion recollected in tranquility. So it came out in 1919 in a journal, and it was an instant hit. And people also started imitating, practicing this theory, and it had a wide impact on the modern poets, because modern poets, in fact, discarded the romantic approach to poetry mostly, except for some minor poets, and they became objective and impersonal and uh, pruning and cutting as much as possible the romantic strains. So Eliot starts with a deconstruction of the word tradition, which is usually known in England then. He says tradition is a very weighty word, and it is very difficult to acquire tradition or the historical sense. And without this historical sense, one cannot be a poet. With this, he starts his essay. Now, there are plenty of other things which Eliot could say or illustrate or explain if he could linger the essay a bit. But maybe there was some problem in every great writer has this problem of expressing what he or she feels exactly about his thesis. And so even Sri Aurobindo could not complete the whole of the future poetry. He was, and the problem was in his expression. Now one wonders that when I'm speaking of Sri Aurobindo lacking in expressive skill, but every writer has it. In a given point of time, there is a lack of expression. So I suspect that Eliot could have written this more elaborately with filling up the limitations of which I will speak in the last part of my talk. Now, coming to the historical sense, uh, Eliot says that it is a thing to be inherited with great labor, and a poet is not alone, standing alone. He is the product of all the past poets, and he has no personal emotion to express because he is actually assimilating and, in a way, recreating, reshaping the tradition of the past. That way, he discards all the possibilities of expressing subjectively about one's own emotion. The poet has no personal emotion to express, and it goes against Wordsworth's theory, two theories: spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, the subjective emotion, and emotion recollected in tranquility. And this historical sense, as Eliot says, is difficult because there are three don'ts which he lists: the danger of being trapped by three don'ts. And he says the past should not be taken as a bolus. It should not be taken as something like a condo, a bolus, a stone that is there and I pick it up. So that is the past. And the second thing he speaks, he warns, he cautions is uh, the past is one particular age won't do. You may be a specialist of the Renaissance. You may be a specialist of the 19th century. You may be a specialist on the age of Dryden. But this one particular edge on do, he says the whole history of Europe from Homer down to the present, this has to be assimilated. And even the minor poets play a role in this assimilation because even the minor poets are contributing to this tradition. So, two don'ts we have seen that the past should not be taken as a bolus. It is not something that you can go and pick up. And the second is it's one or two private edges on do. And the third is one or two private reputations on do. Which means, suppose you have read Hemingway a lot, and your entire focus is on Hemingway. So you will start speaking like Hemingway, and there will be no originality or creativity or transmutation in your poetry. So one particular poet is a no, one particular age, suppose the Renaissance, it is no, and it is not something like a fixed stone which you can go and pick up. Because even the minor reputations contribute to the making of a tradition. So many things theoretically, Eliot is speaking rightly. As a classical theoretician, he is right. But the problem is he's taking the things to an extreme point of objectivity. An extreme point of objectivity when the poet has no emotion to express, no personal emotion to express. He becomes an instrument of communicating what is gone in the past. Early in the essay, Eliot says uh, the existing order is complete before the new work of art arrives. So there is an existing word before you. You can only add to that tradition. The existing the existing monument is complete before the new work of art arrives, and then it adds to the monument. Now, this with this he comes to the second section of the essay, which is uh, true in a way, but once again, I think there is a lack of expressive tools in T.S. Eliot when he says that the poet's mind is like the platinum, which does not change, but it changes all the historical materials of the past. And finally, a new component comes out. Like if the two gases are mixed, a third something comes out of the mixture of the two gases. Uh, Something like that. But who initiates this mixing? The poet's self. He is conducting, he is in a way, as Eliot says in the later part of the essay, a passive attending upon the event. He is watching, he is seeing this chemical transformation is being done. So all the historical materials are being chemically transformed to create a new stuff. And the purpose of the poet is to initiate this transformation as the platinum does without changing itself. As he progresses in the essay, he says, the poet's mind is a receptacle of a numberless feelings and emotions, a storehouse where all the particles, all the images, all the memories, the wait for one moment of creation, that is transmutation. One moment of transmutation when these things are being transformed. There is a moment of this transformation or transmutation or chemical transformation. And when that moment arrives, the poet is able to write by initiating that chemical transformation, and that results in poetry. So you see how the subjective part is totally discarded. In place, it becomes an impersonal stuff, an impersonal theory of poetry. As he says, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. The business of the poet is not to express any personal emotion, but to work up with the old emotions, old experiences. And about this chemical transformation, this transmutation, Eliot says a great variety is possible. So a great variety is possible, like Keats does it in a way. Uh, Agamemnon, in Agamemnon, the writer does it in a way, and in Othello, Shakespeare does it in a way. So in there are many kinds of transmutation. He's right. There are many kinds of transmutation because that makes every poet an individual poet. Uh, that makes every poet an individual poet. And so Eliot says variety of transmutation is possible. And finally, towards the close of the essay, the third part is very, very short. Eliot ends up abruptly uh, with the statement that the poet's mind is, uh, the poet has no emotion to express. He has to escape from himself. So, in a way, this is a theory which speaks of the historical sense or the tradition, same thing. The historical sense, itihas bodh or tradition, which is to be expressed in a new way and with a chemical transformation of the old material. And the poet has just to initiate this chemical transformation without being subjective, without being personal. Now, this is his theory, and at the end, he says it's something like a passive attending upon the event. Now, imagine 1919 is a time when W.B. Yeats has written some of his best poems. Especially in the last 5 or 6 years, he was even practicing Eliot's theory with a slight difference because he doesn't believe in erasing the self. But Yeats's early poetry is totally subjective. It could be that Yeats was aiming Eliot. Eliot was aiming Yeats. This has come to me, the idea has come to me very recently, considering that Yeats's early poetry is entirely subjective. It follows the old pattern, the romantic pattern of Wordsworth and Sri Aurobindo. And so in 1919, Yeats was already uh, an acknowledged poet. So it could be that Yeats was trying to deconstruct the old form. But there is one thing in Yeats, I think he takes something of Eliot's theory, uh, but he tones down the personal stuff. He doesn't write like Shelley, exuberant stuff. He he stands apart and speaks of his emotion, romantic emotion, but in a very restrained way. That is good, and that is the way to write good poetry or great poetry. But what Eliot says is something which is a bit absurd because he stretches it out too far. So it is when you write the answer, in fact, for every answer, you have to give the summary of the piece and then you have to critique the essay. What are the plus points and what are the minus points of tradition and individual talent? So, what are the plus points? Eliot is definitely, in a way, true, right? because he doesn't like the excess of emotion in poetry, because it is said that English writing before Eliot was in a chaotic state. Everybody was full of emotion and expressing emotion directly, and it was a chaos of subjective poetry. And many things in the essay are also quite true about the creation of true poetry, like the historical sense. But the strange thing is that Eliot is an American basically. And while writing the piece, he forgets totally about Ralph Waldo Emerson, who has plenty of things to say about tradition or historical sense. Where, in an essay entitled The American Scholar in 1837, which was entitled as Phi Beta Kappa Address, it was a famous address by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which speaks of the role of tradition in creative writing. Eliot never refers to that because Emerson is a spokesperson of intuitive literature, and Emerson is a towering personality. So I see as I grow mature, I see that there was something not quite good in T.S. Eliot, that he is not even referring to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who spoke plenty of things about tradition and historical sense. And then there is no reference to Whitman. And because, of course, Whitman was subjectivizing, but even in Whitman, there was an aloofness. Even when Whitman speaks of himself, it is not his own voice. It is the accumulated voice of the Americans of humanity. So it was a total voice. And possibly Eliot was meaning this in his theory, that it should be an accumulated voice of the past, of the present, of the future. But there was either a misconception of Whitman's poetry, or he was not happy about the towering presence of Whitman behind him. So, in any case, the role of tradition is quite apt. And about the chemical transformation, he stretches it too far. It is actually something else, which I will speak as a critique of the piece. So, what are the limitations of this? The point is, Eliot forgets about Shakespeare. He is also a master of negative capability. Eliot is a fan of John Keats because he can be impersonal even in his subjective utterance. He can practice the negative capability, and Shakespeare was a master of negative capability. But still, Shakespeare could discover a poetry which goes beyond all tradition. So there is a poetry which can go beyond all tradition. That poetry is, Sri Aurobindo calls it discovery, rhythmic voyage of self-discovery, the hidden spiritual excitement, the word that is to be discovered. In Rabindranath calls it Vani, that is word with capital W, Vani. So this Vani has to be discovered. And in Shakespeare, there are plenty of instances of this discovery. He is one of the greatest of poets. Sri Aurobindo chooses 11 poets for the utter first class. And Shakespeare comes in the first row. In the first row, we have uh, Vyasa, we have Homer, Vyasa, Valmiki, and Shakespeare. In the second row, we have Dante, Milton, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. And in the last row, Goethe stands in solitary grandeur. So he chooses, he was not willing to do this, but he was pressed to speak of his best choice, and he was refusing to do that. He said, "No, I can't." He told Satan, "I'm not going to pass the gods through a competitive examination. They are gods of poetry. How can I go to pass them through a competitive examination?" But Satan was insistent, and Sri Aurobindo had to say about his the very best in his mind. Now, all these poets were aware of this discovery. And in Shakespeare, for instance, the line in Macbeth, "Still it cried to all the house, Glemis hath murdered sleep, therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." Or the very bear, Shakespeare has two styles. One is decorative, that is also good. He uses plenty of rhetoric. But the best is a very bare, intuitive style in Shakespeare. You can overlook it as something dull, but these are the greatest lines of Shakespeare. Like in the Sleepwalking Sin, there is one bare question which startles you up, and they come from infinite sources. They are discoveries. The Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? The Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? Or Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. These are lines which go beyond history, no reading. It comes as a discovery from the inmost or from the highest sources of inspiration, either from the inmost self of the poet as a discovery of the hidden word of the word Vani, or from the very high sources of inspiration which lie above our head. They are called overhead inspiration. So this element of discovery, Eliot never speaks of this. There is plenty of there are plenty of poems which behind which there are no tradition at all, because they are discoveries, intuitive discoveries, revelations. First. The second is Eliot never speaks of music. That is also a great gap. In 1842, Eliot wrote an essay on the music of poetry. There he speaks of music a bit, but he cannot link up this. He does speak of a vibration coming before the words have come. It is very strange that words haven't come, but the vibration has come to the poet. He talks of that, but not in this piece. So in many ways, this piece has many limitations. And finally, if we speak of tradition, is it just the books that contribute to your tradition? Because there are various sources of collecting knowledge from your day-to-day life. Various sources of collecting knowledge from your day-to-day acquaintances. In Bengali, we call it adda, but the sophisticated word is acquaintance. Your acquaintance with all the friends, and not just the people of high society, but a fisherman, as Oscar Wilde has said somewhere, that a fisherman can give you plenty of materials for poetry. So This mixing up with human beings, this life, this suffering, I think Eliot was too much confined in his library. He couldn't come out uh, like our proverbial chaiwala in the market. You see the chaiwala when he speaks, whatever you may have against him, but when he speaks, he has plenty of experiences of life because he came from a very lower rank. He was not a very rich person. He came from a very low rank, so he has all the experiences of the world. That is why he is such a brilliant speaker, whatever may be his faults and limitations. So you have to mix up with people. But I suspect Eliot was confined to his library, and that made him forget about the fact that tradition can also be acquired from your mixing with friends, your failures in love, your personal distresses, your frustrations, your wrongdoings, your mistakes, your remorse, everything. So that way, Hemingway has plenty of life in his writings, plenty of. He is, in fact, writing poetry in his first 6 novels. He is writing poetry, concealed poetry in prose. And all Hemingway's poetry comes out of life, not from books, although he was a voracious reader. Even many people didn't believe that Hemingway was a voracious reader. Michael Jackson, Michael Reynolds in 1981 explored the register of Hemingway's school, and he found that Hemingway borrowed 1088 books. So, not that he was not a great reader of books, but the basis of Hemingway's historical sense or tradition comes from his life, his acquaintances, his struggle, the fire of life, which is the material of his fiction. Poetry, in fact, because his prose is like poetry. So these are the 3 basic limitations in Eliot's essay. He is ignoring, he is forgetting about Shakespeare, the great discoveries in poetry, about Homer. Of course, he is speaking of Western literature, European literature, and unfortunately, his own poetry is also affected by these artificial and absurd strays on tradition and this impersonality, because at one point your personal self has to mix up with the universal self. He doesn't know the secret of this. How would you blend your personal self with the impersonal universal self? This is a trick you cannot, this is not a trick. You cannot be taught unless you are a great poet. And Eliot is not as great a poet as W.B. Yeats or Walt Whitman or Rabindranath Tagore. They are genuine poets because they could forget their readings and their new life. They could mix up a lot with people. And there's no talk of music, which is the essence of poetry. Without the knowledge of music, you can't be a poet. And finally, as I've said, that book is not the only source. So that's all for today, and I will take your questions and answer over the queries. Next day, I will go through the text. I will see the highlights in the text. I'll show you as a repetition. I've spoken all, in fact, today. But still, I will highlight the passages from Eliot's text so that you can write in your answer. So now I will take questions. Well, Eliot is a great critic. Apart from this essay, he has written a lot of critical prose, and he's one of the greatest of prose writers in the language, maybe one of the 10 great prose writers of the language. But when it comes to poetry, uh, even as a critic of poetry, he has plenty of good things to say, right things to say, but there are plenty of things which are missing in his thesis on tradition and individual talent. And I have listed those things. Yes, ask. There's a question on objective correlative. Let me explain this. That doesn't come in this essay. It is in Hamlet and His Problems. Eliot's essay, Hamlet and His Problems, where he uses the phrase objective correlative. The phrase is not his, he takes it from a French writer, and it means that whatever is happening inside you should be communicated properly with the right kind of rhetoric to your audience. If there is a failure in this communication, then there is a lack of objective correlative. And Eliot's examples are Macbeth is a success because what happens inside Macbeth we know through the images, the smell of blood, perfumes of Arabia, everything, every kind of sensations inside Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, we can see it through the external images. But in Hamlet, we do not know exactly what is happening inside Hamlet. Hamlet cannot express or cannot say something through which we can understand what is exactly happening in Hamlet. There is a failure of rhetoric to understand what exactly happens inside Hamlet. And this failure is called the failure of objective correlative. So, objective correlative simply means you say something which will exactly express your feelings and emotions to the reader, to the audience. That is objective correlative. Objectively, you have to subjectivize your feelings and emotion and thoughts.
Anyone else wants to ask anything? Kindly type out the message. I am facing a problem in the in-call messages actually. People keep joining the lecture. So the last part of my chat is not visible at all. So Palak, have you asked your question to sir? Because I can
Yes,
see that you have asked the question, but I cannot read your question.
Yes,
ma'am, I
he,
have asked.
You
he
have
has
asked the question, right?
asked the
Okay.
question on negative capability.
Okay, okay. The
Why
theory of
Shakespeare?
impersonality, yes. So now somebody else has posted the question, and I can only see a patch where Anveshan Yogi has left or other people have joined. That patch is actually not at all visible.
So I have answered it. Still, let me explain it more.
Ma'am,
Shakespeare
my
is
name is Pooja Pal.
okay. Actually, Shakespeare is standing behind all his characters separately, and this has never happened in the history of literature, on the history of humanity, that a poet can enter into every character and speak like him. And the poet, who is the real poet speaking, you can't follow. Who is the real Shakespeare? Only in the sonnet you can touch the real Shakespeare. Something of the subjective is there. Otherwise, in the drama, which voice is Shakespeare's own voice, you can't understand. Now, it's a long question. I couldn't read it. But definitely, he is a better critic. He is as a critic, he will survive long. But as a poet, I don't think with the advent of, with the renewed interest in Tagore and Yeats, and with the coming of Sri Aurobindo and Whitman on the scene again, it is very difficult for Eliot to survive as a poet. But as a critic, definitely he will survive, because it is not true because he has some limitations in this essay. Eliot is not a good critic. This is no, he is a great critic. He has written thousands of pages on different characters, different plays. So he's a great critic, definitely. As a poet, I don't think his reputation is going to last long.
So the next question is somebody called Anushya Sen, one of our students. She has asked, what devices has Eliot used to bring newness to his poetry?
Actually, he was introducing newness through his objective method, which makes it very dull. But actually, they are very intellectual statements, even in four quarters. I was reading four quarters today. I was trying to find if there is anything of discovery in him. But I find even in four quartets, he is giving intellectual statements on mysticism and religion instead of revealing or realizing or giving out his experiences. Because I don't think he has experiences on mysticism and religion proper. He has not experienced things. He's speaking from his reading and from his intellect, from his buddhi, not from his soul, not from realized experience. Eliot's poetry is not realized experience, and whatever is experienced is only something of the outer things. Even his Westland is seen from the intellectual standpoint, not from the intuitive standpoint. So the intuitive stuff is missing in Eliot's poetry, and it is all in intellect. That is the newness of modern poetry, because he is the beginning. He's the pioneer of modern poetry, because speech becomes intellectual instead of intuitive. All the channels of intuition are blocked because poetry becomes intellectual, economical, and it lacks in that rhythmic voyage or rhythmic voice of life. It is not a rhythmic voice of inner life, it is rather an intellectual exploration of human life, and there must be some limitations in this, but this is newness, because more and more poetry becomes intellectual through the theory of T.S. Eliot. But this will go, this won't last long, because there is another stream coming in, which speaks of the intuitive self.
So the next question is from Shreya Mukherjee. So she has asked, whenever I create something, it reflects my personality, my emotions. But Eliot says that art is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. What does this mean?
And that is in the core of Eliot's theory of poetry, because he is contradicting Wordsworth's theory. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and that should be the theory. And even in Wordsworth, there is a restraint, especially in the early poetry of Wordsworth. There is a great economical force, a restraint, even in his subjectivity. Wordsworth loses this power in his later poetry. But till 1815, Wordsworth had that power to economize the speech, and that made him both spontaneously emotional and at the same time economical. But I don't know why Eliot does not like it, and he is speaking of an impersonality which is not natural. You have to labor a lot to do this kind of intellectual poetry. It is a making of poetry rather a discovering of poetry, a manufacture of poetry, and he virtually manufactures his poetry. This is not done, and but uh, modern minds have accepted this. T.S. Eliot has become a hero, and only recently people have, uh, with comparison with Rabindranath Tagore and Whitman, people have come to know this is real poetry and this cannot be poetry proper. You are right in questioning Eliot's abnormal impersonality.
Good evening, sir. It's me, Anjali Tiwari. Sir, my question is that giving the example of Revenger's Tragedy by Thomas Middleton, Eliot says that the emotion in poetry should be flat. He said that when a poet becomes personal, the whole while writing poetry, he became a bad poet because he became unconscious where he should be conscious and became conscious where he should be unconscious. So
Yes,
my question from this is that, my question is that how a poet is supposed to keep his emotions flat. Like even if we don't look at the romantic poetry, if we look at the war poems, like there are some strong emotions which are getting involved in the poetry, and that's how that poetry becomes living. So how a poetry is supposed to be flat?
yes, he means that the same thing. The business of the poet is not to express new emotions, but to work out the old emotions, and that makes it so dull and flat because it is not spontaneous. And Sri Aurobindo's definition is a rhythmic voyage of self-discovery. Only then poetry becomes a living thing, a living object. But it becomes flat and dull because you are artificially speaking for other voices, which are not your voices. This kind of thing is not even proper negative capability. Even Yeats's poetry has plenty of negative capability, even though he is a subjective poet. But this kind of negative capability is not true negative capability. This is an absurdity in poetry. Perhaps I'm being too critical about Eliot, but you have to write something on it because the guidebooks don't give you these points. I've seen all the guidebooks, there is no criticism of Eliot. They give you just the summary. But Harold Bloom has spoken against Eliot. David Duchess has spoken against Eliot. Duchess has called him a great minor poet in the Delhi seminar in 1963. Bloom has been critical about Eliot, that Eliot is not a poet at all. But you don't say that. He is a good poet, a mediocre poet maybe, but a great critic.
Sir, good evening.
Yes.
Sir, actually, Eliot was trying to come out from provincialism. He combats provincialism. He moves out of England and he talks about a European. He talks about many things other than that he's produced within England itself as a significant milestone where an English critic is writing to move out of the provinciality and the delimiting way in which literature criticism has been viewed and talked about European tradition at all together. Can you please give me some examples how he proceed these ideas within his writings?
Yes, because Eliot is a great scholar. You have to remember that. He has read Dante, he has read Homer, he has read Aeschylus, he has read Euripides. So the entire European tradition is to be assimilated according to Eliot, not just the English tradition. And that makes him not a native poet, but a European poet. And Europe has various kinds of culture. Like if you are a Bengali, suppose you are a Bengali, and your sensibilities will be very Bengali if you are trying to write as an original poet. But unless you have traveled, you have lived with the Tamils, Telugus, Konkanis, and others, and have inherited their spirit, you can't do that. Because if you look at Jivanananda Das, how he universalized his personal feelings. So you must be native, and this lack of nativity, you are speaking of this lack of nativity in T.S. Eliot, and this is not a strong point when it comes to writing poetry, because a poet is born through his native. When I write something in English as a practicing poet, when I write something, I Rabindranath is constantly peeping through me. Why? Because I'm a Bengali, and he peeps in through me continuously. And Eliot believed that you have to acquire the entire European tradition to be a poet. I don't think this is important, because everything is inside you. And where you have lived, your surroundings, which you know, you have grown up in a place with the grass. Even Whitman is speaking of the whole of the world, but he can do it with a different kind of impersonality, not the kind of objectivity that Eliot does or speaks of. In a way, he is correct, but nativity is very important. Whitman is strongly rooted in America, and from America he goes out. Whitman is not a European, but he is strongly rooted in America, and still he is called a universal poet. Rabindranath is strongly Bengali, and still he is called a universal poet. And there it is a critical error from the point of view of T.S. Eliot. He shouldn't have said this. Even you are basing your writings on England, in England, of England, or on England or English themes, you can be a great poet. But he spoke of, because he was a scholar, he thought everybody should read Homer, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Dante. But poetry is something different. It is inside you, and the language is shaped by the fire of life, by the experiences of life. It is not scholarly stuff. For Eliot, it is a manufacture of scholarly stuff. And this is a scholar cannot a scholar can be a poet, but he has to suspend the scholar in him. He has to forget. You know, in Murder in the Cathedral, the problem is Eliot is constantly quoting from the Bible instead of reminding. As Ritwik Ghatak once said, এমন একটি ভাষা হবে যেটি মনে পড়িয়ে দেবে কিন্তু যেটি রেফারেন্সে ভারাক্রান্ত হবে না. So Eliot's language is laden with references, is loaded with references. It doesn't remind. He's not a master of allusive style. He speaks of allusive style. He speaks of the mythical method, but he is not a master of the mythical method. Yeats is a master of the mythical method, because in Yeats you won't see this artificiality. And in Yeats you will enjoy reading because it comes out of his experience, from his lifeblood. And it comes from Eliot's head as a scholar.
Thank you, sir. So means actually, on the other hand, he is celebrating and acknowledging the significance of individual talent. But on the other hand, he is saying we shall be also conscious about the departure made by one age to other, one literary tradition to other. Means we also need to pay attention to the continuity that become more importance over here than the originality or individuality of a writer himself. And he says that the present reminiscent of the dead poets may be found in his individual works. This is how the immortality of tradition works are asserted. But how is
Jyoti, if
it
you have a
possible that
question,
tradition?
Jyoti, if you have a question, you have to make it short. You cannot speak for such a long time because others will not get a chance. And when you have asked one question and he's responded, please do not immediately pose another question because there are more questions in the group. For example, Devanjana has posted a question. So though we know that individual and tradition are two quite different words, what kind of relationship we can find between tradition and individual talent? Let him please answer everybody's questions. Then, if he has more time, he will circle back to you.
Yes, let me explain this. And it is true. I believe in this. that without being traditional, you cannot be creative. Eliot is not discarding the role of individuality. Creativity is a different definition for Eliot. For me, for those who have read Tagore, Whitman, Carpenter, Sri Aurobindo, Shelley, for us, the definition is different. The definition of originality is different. But for Eliot, the concept of originality is rooted in tradition. Because simply, in my own sentence, let me sum up the answer to your question. Uh, Without being traditional, you cannot be creative. You cannot be creative without knowing the historical sense. In a way, this is true. This is not wrong. But when he speaks of an absurd objectivity, impersonality, then it strikes us to be an absurdity. That chemical transformation and the total eclipse of the self, that is, I think, a bit too much. The total eclipse of the self. Yes, tradition, without tradition, you cannot be creative. But Eliot speaks of a complete eclipse of your personal self. That is where we should object to. That cannot be done. You can be restrained, you can be objective, you can be restrained in your emotion, like W.B. Yeats. As a romantic, he is not like Shelley. He's very controlled, very withdrawn, but at the same time, he is speaking of both historical sense and his own emotion. So, simply, your answer is without being traditional, you cannot be creative. Because creativity does not fall from sky.
Thank you so much, sir, for your answers. I now, it's almost 8:30. We are out of time. So I now request Prolada, who's our head of the department, to kindly deliver the end note for this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gargi, for giving me a chance to say something at the end of this lecture. Sir, before coming to close the event, I like to share my observation with you. I like to know from you one thing that you are repeatedly telling that according to Eliot, poetry is transformation of the poet's personal emotion into art emotion, right?
Transformation of the historical materials.
Historical materials or into third unit. Okay. So
third unit, yes.
So can you make a semblance between Coleridgean term, that is esemplastic imagination, or secondary imagination? That means dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates in order to recreate.
Exactly. Eliot is suggesting the method of Coleridge, but while Coleridge is a successful practitioner of this theory, Eliot is not. Coleridge is a better poet than Eliot because he does it more naturally and with the full involvement of his personal self, not that absurd withdrawal of subjectivity, not that artificial withdrawal of subjectivity. Coleridge is a greater poet than T.S. Eliot.
Okay. Thank you, sir. My second question is, you have told that Coleridge was Eliot was the first modern poet. So don't you think that Chaucer was also the first modern poet? Actually, modernism is a multidimensional concept. It is much more connotative and denotative than denotative in meaning.
No, that
At
way.
a certain level, it refers to reality orientation.
That is a different thing. That is a different thing. That because that is a renaissance that is coming through Chaucer, and the Renaissance is called the early modern age. And because many of the concepts of one, but in poetry, modernism specifically means economy, breaking of rhythms, plenty of plenty of things through your punctuation and half completed sentences, and trying to mean something through an economical mode, and breaking the rhythm, of course. And it is matter of fact, more matter of fact, and so suggestive, and that makes the whole picture of modernism. So by modern poetry, these things are meant, and you mean the entire consciousness of man, which is awaking after Chaucer, because Chaucer is the first who comes out of the bondage of medieval morality, and
Right.
that way, from the point of view of consciousness, Chaucer is a very modern person. But as a poet, the modern poetry has certain trains. These trains are masculine elements, economy, and those suggestive element, and not that direct rhythmic pattern, broken sentences, broken lines, and trying to say something. These are the elements, and through Eliot is the first to make it very prominent, and then the other poets, they followed him. And of course, there are variations I can't name, but like Laurie Lee, one of the moderns, uh, who started maybe in the 1950s or 60s. Laurie Lee's poetry is quite personal. There are personal voices here and there, but basically modernism affected the entire, because people thought of society, people thought of problems, sociological problems, and they thought these problems have to be communicated through poetry, and naturally poetry took a different kind of shape, and Eliot is the beginning of that kind of poetry.
So Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a veritable picture gallery of social strata.
Yes, that makes the theme, because Chaucer is a narrative poet. He's telling stories, and the modern poets are not telling stories; they are suggesting things. So, a narrative poet and a lyric poet are two different things. Eliot is writing objective lyrics. The modern poets are writing objective lyrics.
Then what do you
And
say about the metaphysical poets? Eliot himself claims that metaphysical poets have some modern qualities.
metaphysical poets have some modern qualities, because the metaphysicals are also writing like the moderns. They are assorting various elements. They are also economical. They are also suggestive, and they are very frank like the moderns. They don't hide anything. And also the element of sexuality, which you see in Donne, which is quite modern, which comes with Lawrence and others in modern poetry, in modern prose also. So that makes the only Vaughan is a class apart. He is universal. He cannot be classified with them. But John Donne is definitely a modern poet. He has all the characteristics, or most of the characteristics of modern poetry, except for the language. I mean, the language was different in 17th century. Like no man is an island entire in itself, not entire in itself. These words are not modern words, but the way of speaking, the economizing of speech, these things make John Donne a modern poet. And on the other hand, Herbert is too religious. He is sometimes a bore with his religious preachings, but he has a sincerity. But you can't call him quite modern, because we have come out of religion these days.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Well, at the fang end of this event, I like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Ghoshal on behalf of the Department of SNG College and my colleagues, Professor Rima Ghosh and Gargi Bhattacharya, for their constant support. Especially, I like to thank Rima, who has conceived the entire embryo of arranging such program. And finally, I thank my students for giving patient hearing and
Yes, the questions were also
responses.
good. Questions were also very good. Most of the questions were good. It's a good class.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
So
Gargi, can you say something? Rima, will you say something? Yes, definitely. We are looking forward to.
in the next class, I will be more specific about the exam, about the answer in the exam to be written. And there are two possible questions which I will discuss, the link between them and how the question may be posed, and also certain highlights from the essay. I will, because this is a difficult piece, it needs some kind of repetition through the text. I will do that in the next class.
Thank you, sir. Students, the session is formally at an end. You can disconnect if you want. Sir, we'll see you very soon. Thank you so much for initiating us into this discussion. Thank you. Good night, all.